So it gives me great pleasure to introduce you to the current president of Geoff Waddington, current president of IIMS even, Geoff Waddington. It's been a long day, Geoff. Because you are one of three people who are responsible for me sitting here. You were on the interview panel 7 years ago. That's how long I've known you now. And decided that I was the man for this job, and it's been a great partnership. You're doing a great job as president. I have to say that because you paid me £5 earlier to say it. No, seriously, Geoff, you're doing a wonderful job as president. And when I invited Geoff to do this, again, this is a concept that I picked up in America with James Rain earlier this year, when a surveyor simply came up with a load of photos and talked through some of the crazy things that you see. And I would suggest that that photo there on the left is a pretty crazy photo of what you might see on survey. So I encourage Geoff to empty the contents of his photo library. He's got 100 photos, and he's going to talk you through them. So you've got about an hour, Geoff, and good luck.
Yeah, okay. Well, thank you, Mike. And welcome to all those watching. I think we've got quite an audience here, and I think some of you guys probably deserve a medal for sitting through the whole day, but I hope it's all been entertaining for you. But this is a bit of a bit light-hearted. I'm going to try not to name names or point fingers, but there's some pretty interesting stuff in amongst these photos. I've tried to limit my library of nightmares, but there's some thought-provoking pictures here which I think you might find interesting as we go along. Yeah. So if you're all ready, we'll start at the beginning. So hull below the waterline. Okay, this particular shot is a vessel that was being built ashore in Portugal, and it was being built to a design from a well-known designer, and the guy was making, it's an 85-foot motor yacht, and he built the whole thing from scratch. So he laminated the hull in sections on a table, and then glassed the sections together to form the hull. And although he professed to be a well disciplined and knowledgeable boat builder, he asked me to come along on behalf of insurers to see what he'd managed to achieve. Well, as you can see, it's sitting in a cradle, but the keel line is not quite straight. So this was a bit of a clue that things haven't gone quite according to plan. When I removed some of the paint, I found that maybe his laminating wasn't quite up to scratch either. So this shows the fact that the boat in certain areas, in fact a lot of areas, there was actually dry laminate with no resin whatsoever. Even where there was resin, there wasn't a lot of it. So you can still see all the fibers in this one. And here, well, we have got some resin, but again, we've still got the fibers, dry fibers visible underneath. The outcome of this was that he was going to launch the boat, and he wanted to undertake some large ocean-going trips in it. I had to advise him in one instance not to launch the boat without carrying out an awful lot of repair work to the hull. He was very disappointed about this and less than complimentary to my decision. And anyway, he went away and he launched the boat irrespective, and it remained afloat for a little while before it started to sink. The boat now, I believe, is back out ashore, and I think he lives on the boat, but I don't think he's going to live on the boat in the water. This one here, another whole issue. This really, well, we'll go through the story really. This is a brand new boat. that was in the Dusseldorf boat show. On the way back from the Dusseldorf boat show, something happened to the hull. When the boat was lifted back out of the water here in the UK by the manufacturer, this is what they found. So the decision on the manufacturer was that the boat had obviously struck an object and suffered some damage. This is the area of damage. So I pointed out to the manufacturer that it couldn't have struck an object, because if it had done, the object, whatever it had hit, would have written off the stern gear. So unless the boat has dropped vertically onto something and then lifted immediately vertically off it, there was no hope of actually having impact damage to the outer hull. The investigations carried on, and I had a look on inside the boat and found that there were cracks to the stiffening inside. So obviously the boat had suffered some trauma. And then I noticed some burn marks on the hull where they'd welded a frame where the hull had been supported in the Dusseldorf show. And it looked as though the vast majority, certainly from midships, the boat was unsupported. So all of the weight was being concentrated in the midship section. I suppose it looked dramatic to have 30 odd feet of boat sticking out for people to look at, but the reality was that they were causing a lot of damage to the hull. Eventually this had resulted in a crack in the hull, and then on the return journey the water found its way into that crack and eventually peeled off the outer laminate. The reason the outer laminate peeled off so well was because it hadn't been properly constructed, because the boat was actually one of the first of this model to be resin infused, and unfortunately the resin infusion process had not gone according to plan. Needless to say, the delivery skipper, who was being blamed for the incident, was no longer blamed for the incident, and everything went very quiet, and the factory undertook the repairs to put the boat back to normal. So, I mean, there's a brand new boat, and it's 75 feet long, so it's not a little boat, and you can imagine that, that they were quite upset about that. But there we go, it was their fault. This outer bottom has been painted with a silicon-based antifoul. This was a picture of the boat as it was at time of survey. To be perfectly honest, you'd have to be a pretty amazing surveyor to determine whether or not the underlying hull had any defects with a paint coating in this condition. And this was how it came to light in the end, because it was eventually found that the boat had a severe problem underneath in the form of blistering. Unfortunately, it's very difficult to determine that because of the poor state of the outer hull coatings, which somebody had obviously applied themselves. Well, I'm not sure how they applied it, but I think you can see from that. So where there were obvious signs of blistering, this is what we found. Again, we've got dry laminate inside, which has formed the blister. And when the paint was removed, you could see the extent of the blistering underneath. The lesson to be learned here is, and I hope the lesson that the surveyor learned, was that you need to remove paint in order to determine what the condition of the underlying hull is. You can't remove all of the paint. Therefore, if you can't determine the state of the hull, then you should recommend that all of the paint is removed. Because unless you do so, you'll never know what the underlying problems are. And that's what caused the surveyor to get himself into deep water. So on the subject of blistering and hull blistering, this one's a little bit easier. These are large blisters on a hull which has been painted properly, but at least it means that you can see what's going on underneath. So you don't really need to remove a lot of paint to say that this hole's got a problem with blistering. That's a fairly a no-brainer. This one here was a vessel. It was quite a new vessel. It was only 9 months old, and it was suffering from gel blistering. The interesting thing here is that this blistering was concentrated in one area, and there it is. And that is a typical roller mark. That's where somebody in the construction of the vessel used a dirty roller, or on that particularly got to the end of a mix and continued to roller it into the mold. And so you've got literally one roller's width of blistering in one part of the hull only. Unfortunately, though, all the paint had to be removed and we had to do gel repairs, but they were limited. They could be limited to that area only. And this is something you see quite a lot on boats, where you'll find that there is one particular area of hull blistering, and very often it's starboard aft, because people start putting the gel into the hull normally port side aft, work forward and then work back, and then by the time you get to the end of your pot of gel, you've got to the starboard aft area of the hull, and that's where the gel's starting to go off, and you shouldn't be putting it in the mold, but you're doing it anyway, and it all goes horribly wrong. So this particular boat was starboard forward, so I'm not sure where they started rolling that in, but certainly that was an issue in laminating up the hull. Another one, wind and water line, another typical area where you'll find it, even though there was no sign of blistering anywhere on the hull. Other than that, it was starting at the wind and water line, which is, again, fairly typical. This is an old blister. So when the paint was removed, to have a look at what's underneath, we could see that although the hull didn't have any blistering now, it did have blistering in the past, which had been opened up and then overpainted. This one here harks back to the earlier, where we started really, which is a problem with the hull when it was actually laminated up in the first instance. And what it was that the gel had not adhered to the underlying laminate. So the clue was that there was a couple of areas where it had actually broken off, and this one in particular. And what happened is you could actually get your fingernail under there and you could just pick the gel off the hull. So the gel, the outer gel, was not stuck to the hull in any shape or form anywhere. And really, it all basically fell off. I don't think we need to dwell too much on this one. This was a wooden boat that suffered damage when it was lifted out of the water. The owner of the boat blamed the boatyard for causing the damage to the hull because he said they hadn't lifted it correctly. And unfortunately, when I went to look at the boat, I'm not sure that it was actually the fault of the hoist. I think there might have been something else going on. I could actually push my hand through the hull on this particular boat. So that's sort of just some little hull nightmares that come along. I mean, you know, there's lots of degrees of hull issues. I know Paul's watching and smiling in the background. You know, sometimes it's fairly obvious what's going on, and sometimes it's not. And although I'm not one of these that supports scraping off masses of paint off somebody's nice boat, you obviously do have to have a look and see what's underlying. But if you can't see what's going on underneath the paint, then at least say you can't see what's going on underneath the paint, and suggest the paint is removed so that further inspections can be carried out. Because if you don't, and then eventually somebody does take the paint off and find out their hull's gone horribly wrong, they're going to come straight back to the surveyor and say, well, why didn't you tell me this? or why didn't you advise me about that? And you know, there goes your insurance. So here's some keel issues. This one, quite self-explanatory, really. Obviously, there's been some movement in the keel. Water's got onto the palms, and it's starting to push away the laminate where the keel's been glassed to the hull. Another instance here where you've got a hull to keel joint, which is separated. Somebody's had a little job going around this with some Sikaflex to try and solve the problem, but it's continued to bleed. Inside, the clue was that you can see that this area has been regelled. So they've actually done some work inside to cover up the cracks. And it's quite obvious that the keel bolts have been replaced and somebody's cut them off with a grinder when they finished putting new bolts in. So the story here is that you know that there has been a major issue with the keel. There has been repairs carried out and the keel has been taken off and replaced. Here's a bilge keeler. Quite typically grounding damage from sitting on a hard bottom, drying out. So repeatedly, the boat had suffered trauma to its bilge keels. And again, the clue was get inside, have a look and see what's going on. And here we go. So there's the attachments for the same keel. Obviously in a poor state of repair, and also somebody's carried out some some unattractive repairs to try and stiffen up the area in way of the keel. I think Paul could probably say, he could probably tell you exactly what boat this is, just from what we're looking at there, because we've all seen this before. Now this keel was a bit of an issue because it was a case of my boat's been recently damaged in an incident. Well, as you can see, it wasn't that recently damaged in the incident because it's taken the time for all these barnacles to grow on the areas where all the gel has been scraped off the bottom of the keel of the boat. The area was quite extensive, as you can see in this photograph here, all the way along the length of the keel. The gel had been stripped off and it had been lying in the water ever since, probably for in excess of 12 months. So whipping through, because I've only got another half hour and we've got a long way to go. Here's some engine space issues. A nice piece of wiring. See a lot of this. This is where somebody's rewired his shower sump pump, and also there was a bilge pump wired into this as well. And I'm not sure that that's actually waterproof. And bearing in mind it's in the bilge, I don't think that that would pass muster somehow. This set of breakers here has also suffered a little bit of water ingress, which came from a leaking deck, and we'll see that when we get to the deck section later on where the water was actually coming from. But again, a major problem. The guy who was talking previously was talking about, somebody was asking about boats that had sunk. And one of the issues with boats that have been submerged to any degree is that wiring, once it's immersed in water, tends to soak up the water by capillary action. And the recommendation, certainly my recommendation, when boats have suffered partial immersions, is that what you've got to do is rewire it, because you might think that you're going to get away with it, but then later on you'll probably have wiring which is going to fail, could even cause a fire in the boat because the water's got in there and corroded the wiring inside. So although you can't see it, once the water's in the wiring, you've got a problem. This one here was given to me by my associate, Chris Wilkes. A very interesting one. It came up a little while ago on my mechanical installations presentation that I did. This is a gear cable on a stern drive. on an aluminium rib. This gear cable actually spontaneously combusted and burst into flames. So, which is a bit of a mystery, really. One doesn't expect gear cables to catch fire. So they had to find out why the gear cable was catching fire, and the clue is in the next photograph. The gentleman concerned had fitted a new battery isolator in the compartment underneath the helm, and that is how it was fitted. He didn't actually mount it, he just fitted a battery isolator and left it inside the hull. So the battery isolator was actually earthing itself to the hull, or it was certainly applying live current to the hull, and then the earth came back through the gearbox, through the gear cable, and that's what caused the gear cable to spontaneously combust, because when he tried to start the engine and current was drawn, all the current was flowing through the gear cable to try and complete the circuit. So quite an interesting one, but in the process, bearing in mind this was an aluminium vessel, although the photograph's not very clear, you can see that it also was causing a serious problem on the hull. So not only was the wiring all suffering, also the hull was suffering as well. And all down to the fact that he hadn't fitted his battery isolator and mounted it correctly. Here's one which you've probably all seen. The first time I saw it many years ago now, I must admit I was a bit confused why Volvo Penta would give their engines a 10-year useful lifespan, which if you're buying a large motorboat with a large Volvo Penta engine in it, means that every 10 years you're going to have to spend the best part of £60,000 on engines, and also the additional cost of having them removed and replaced. I think the argument was that they said that basically they had to give an engine a useful life of 1,000 hours. Well, at 1,000 hours, yeah, and certainly in years ago when I was an engineer, that would be the first major service, not the end of the engine. So, but another interesting point on this particular engine plate is that this engine is a recreational engine and is not to be installed on, and it will be out of guarantee if it's used on a commercial vessel. I'm not sure whether Volvo actually told people that before they fitted it in their harbour launch. That engine is the D4, and I've covered D4s before, and here is the classic D4 where the cooler end cover is starting to bleed salt. This was a problem. D4s had other problems when they were first developed with their cooling systems, because they decided to put the strainer after the water pump rather than before the water pump, which put the strainer under water pump pressure, which blew the tops off the strainer boxes and caused a few engine failures. Volvo solved that one, but this is another cooling system problem which they had on the D4, where the end covers and this particular gasket plate in between the end cover and the tube stack itself was made of a different material. So you ended up with 3 different materials with 3 different expansion rates, which meant that when the engine gets hot, the tube stack started to bleed. And once this started, the O-seals inside were letting water past, the corrosion set in, and then forevermore your end covers would bleed. There was a maintenance, a reminder put out to Volvo dealers that at their first major service interval, they need to remove these end covers and replace the gasket plates with a different material plate. But unfortunately, a lot of these did slip through, and it was a bit of a trap for the surveyor because the solution is that you clean off the salt deposits before the surveyor comes and looks at your mechanical installation. He doesn't see anything wrong, said everything's fine. Then the guy buys the boat, and later on he finds out he's got a problem, and the solution to the problem is about £10,000 worth of work. And then he goes back to the surveyor, why didn't you tell me? And the reason is you wouldn't have seen it unless you actually put your head in there while the engine was really hot, probably on sea trials or immediately after sea trials. So you need to go back after sea trials to make sure these end coolers aren't leaking. A lot of them have been fixed by now, but the problems didn't end there, because now it's been found that these coolers, and I had this only a week or so ago, conversation with somebody who had a D4 engine, and I said, have you had your coolers done on the boat? And he said no. And I said, well, you need to get them done as soon as possible, because the boat's over 5 years old and they need to be done. He eventually found all his gearbox oil in the bilge, and his gearbox cooler had actually failed, and dumped his gearbox oil into the bilge, whereupon he got his coolers done. And fortunately for him, the corrosion inside wasn't too bad, and his Volvo agent said, well, you really need to get these done every 10 years. Well, he hadn't actually made his 10 years. My understanding is every 5 years. But again, that's the difference between Volvo agents. Some say one thing, some say something else. This one here, this is actually an exhaust system on a boat. The gentleman who owned the boat had changed his engine. The diameter of the exhaust was different to the one that was fitted to the boat. As you can see, it's much smaller diameter. So the solution was, oh, that's okay. We'll just stick one pipe inside the other and seal it up with Sikaflex. Not sure that that's actually a decent repair. This one here is one for the engineers. This was an insurance claim that was made following a complete overhaul of an engine in a stern drive in a boat, where the engine had been recently stripped and overhauled and rebuilt. He put it in the boat, took his boat out, and he said to me, he said, oh, the engine seemed a bit tight. Needless to say, it lasted 30 minutes before the engine seized. Whereupon he wasn't very happy with the people who had just overhauled his engines, and he decided that he was going to make a claim against them. They said that the reason for the failure was that it was the cooling water system that had failed, because he hadn't instructed them to overhaul the seawater pump when they stripped and rebuilt the engine. So I went down and I looked at this and I thought, well, that isn't an engine overheat problem. This is a lubrication issue. I mean, the oil could be as hot as you like, but it would still be actually lubricating the bearings. So the bearings failed for another reason. At the time, they showed me the bearing shells, but they only showed me the bearing shells on the right. That's these two here. And I thought, well, they don't look too bad. I don't see what's wrong here. So I went away and I got in the car and I was going to leave, and I thought, well, hang on a minute. Where's the other shells? So I went back and I said, where's the rest of the bearing shells? Oh, so then the bucket came out where the other bits and pieces were, and the two bearing shells on the left came out. And that's when the penny dropped, because if you can see that there are little tags on the bearing shells which locate them in the big ends. And the one on the right here clearly shows the tag. The one on the left here shows the tag, but the tag has been compressed. And what had happened was, when they'd rebuilt the engine, they hadn't fitted the shell in the right way round. So when they tensioned up the big end bolts, what they did was they squeezed the bearing shell onto the journal. So actually it was metal to metal contact, which is why it only lasted 30 minutes. So I took the engineer to one side and I said, look, pal, we've all done this. We've all made mistakes. You know, you just put the shells in the wrong way around. I said, what you need to do now is to tell the gentleman that you will repair his engine and you'll do it free of charge because, you know, you may have made a mistake. And just leave it at that. Save your reputation because, you know, you've lost this one, pal. So, and there's another picture there of the compressed shell. Now we're going to get on to something that I've had a little bit of a ramble on this year. I'm not an inland waterways surveyor, and I admit as such. I'm a seagoing person myself. However, getting involved in the inland waterways and the condition that some of these boats are in and the way that some of these boats operate has caused me no end of concern. Now, just looking at that picture, I'm not sure how many of you out there might see what my concerns are, but I think stability is my big concern here. It became apparent to me that a typical narrowboat, being narrowboat by its definition, has quite a low centre of gravity, and its metacentric height and its rising lever is quite low, and so really they're not the most stable vessels in the world. To make them stable, I understand that people tend to fill the bilges with paving slabs and other items to give them a better centre of gravity and make them more stable. This, of course, makes the surveyor's job incredibly difficult because it's okay trying to lift up somebody's floors, which are normally all screwed down anyway, but when you lift the floors up, all you can see is some block paving, and you can't actually see the inside of the hull. So here's some more examples of these wonderful vessels operating in a stable mode. And it worries me to death, to be honest, that people, but I suppose if you haven't got a garden, you just put it on the roof.
Mike here, Geoff. Graham's got the answer to the whole problem. He says it'll have enough beer and wine on board to offset the flower boxes, so you don't need to worry.
Yeah, well, they're certainly going to need something. Yeah. Hopefully they stay in that lovely calm water, which is only about 3 feet deep, and that way they won't come to too much harm. But as you know, as we've been discussing, Mike, there are different categories for inland waterways, and these categories are applied to different craft, which are suitable for certain areas. The problem is the people that operate these boats don't know what those areas are, and they don't know what the categories are. And they venture out, and a vessel very similar to one of these ventured out onto the tidal Thames and rolled over, which generated a lot of issues with the MCA and the Inland Waterways authorities, and they have brought out a set of standards now, but it's the application of those standards which is in question, which is something that we're going to be addressing within the next few months. Here's an inland waterways craft that unfortunately did sink, and I was called in by insurers to go and find out why it sank, and I think even just looking at that photograph, it's quite apparent that there's something untoward been going on. The pipes, the red pipes there that are disappearing underneath a large lump of concrete, which had been poured into the bilge between the cooker on the left here and the bathroom on the right. And this was right in the middle of the boat, and this area was very badly corroded internally. The surveyor who did the survey on this boat couldn't get access to underneath the boat. And this is a problem which has come up again and again on insurance claims against inland waterways craft surveyors, is that they don't get proper access underneath the boat to inspect the outer bottom, in which case they need to say so. This particular boat was surveyed, and he said that the plate work on the outer bottom, when it was tested ultrasonically, was found to be a minimum of 3 millimeters thick. In fact, the boat was made from 3 millimeter plate in the first place, so it didn't have much to lose before it got dangerously thin. So this area here shows where the scale on the inside, I brushed it to one side, took some ultrasonic readings, which is the patches of gel that you can see, and quite right, those areas of ultrasonic readings showed that the outer bottom was in those areas 2.8 millimeters thick, which on an original 3 millimeter thick plate is not too bad at all. Unfortunately, between those two spots, you can see the hole in the bottom, which just goes to prove the point that you can take as many ultrasonic readings as you like, but there's no guarantee that where you're taking the reading is that there isn't any other problems in areas where you're not taking a reading. So get the old hammer out and do some hammer testing, but above all, if you can't inspect the outside of the hull, at least take the effort to inspect the inside of the hull, because if you don't, then the danger is, as with this one, it was taken by truck from where it was surveyed, and it was taken across the country and put in a canal, and it sank within 10 minutes, having had a recent survey. So. Right, propulsion. Here's another nightmare. This is a bow thruster tube, which somebody had obviously decided to fit their own bow thruster. So the material, the tube itself is perfectly good, a nice piece of GRP laminate, and he stuck it through a hole in the hull, and then obviously went down to his local motorist centre, car repair shop, bought himself some isopon, and then stuck the tube to the hull with some isopon. Not quite the quality of an installation that one would like to see. There's another shot of it. Amazingly, it leaked a bit, but it was actually intact. But as I say, I wouldn't guarantee that installation. This one here is an interesting one, because this is actually a problem which is common to this particular stern drive. This is a Mercruiser stern drive, and unfortunately a very good shot that Chris had taken here, because to get your camera in behind the engine where the tiller goes through the transom is difficult on a good day. But these are really good shots of what's actually going on. There you can see the tiller arm going through the transom and what's going on inside. And they suffered very badly from corrosion. And Mercruiser out drives, you need to be really, really careful about this, checking the tiller attachments inside the transom. And access, as you can see here, to get in there and actually see what's going on. You can see even in this shot that everything looks perfectly okay outside, but as soon as you manage to get inside, you can find that everything is very much corroded away. And there's another shot of the same thing. This one here was a survey that I did on a boat that had been recently taken out of the water, and the owner of the boat was particularly perturbed when it was taken out of the water, because water was pouring out of the bottom of the rudder, and he got himself into a bit of a flap. And I said, well, this happens to be a maxi, and for those of you that don't know, maxi took the unusual decision to drill a hole in the bottom of their rudders to allow them to drain. So so the rudder was full of water, and when it was lifted out of the water, all the water ran out the hole at the bottom, and that's quite usual for a maxi. So you know, people say to me, "Oh, my rudder is wet," and I always say to them, "Well, it would be, wouldn't it? Because it's been in the water, and rudders don't. There is nowhere for the moisture to go. If it's a hollow rudder, the moisture will pass through the outer laminate. It'll end up inside, and it's got nowhere else to go. So the readings will always be higher. Also, of course, you don't know what's inside the laminate of a rudder. It can be plywood, it can be foam. Either one of those materials will have a higher moisture content than the rest of the hull. So one would always expect rudders to be a little bit higher. And moisture, as you know, isn't an indication of a defect in itself. It just means that it is high in moisture. The defect is when it all starts to go horribly wrong. Still on stern drives and shafts and things. The issue here is the projection of the propeller away from the P bracket. This issue raised quite a lot due to the fact that manufacturers change their engine installations to make more space inside, and they fit V drives, whereas before they didn't. So before, the engine was in the middle of the boat and everything was hunky-dory, and then they decided to make some extra space inside, put a V drive in there, shift the engine to the back, and then everything starts to go horribly wrong because it's the same hull, but now it's got a completely different mechanical installation. But the issue there is, in order to give lift, they have to increase the lift aft. To increase the lift aft, they fare in above the propeller so that there's a scoop effect which lifts the back end of the boat. In doing that, it decreases the tip clearance between the propeller and the hull. The solution to that is to shift the propeller further away from the hull, which means that it then projects further away from the P bracket, and basically you're just chasing your arse here. You're just going ever downward, and the projections get bigger and bigger. This one, in rule of thumb, it would be 1 times the diameter of the shaft. You certainly wouldn't want to see more than 1.5 times the diameter of the shaft, and this one was almost 3 times the diameter of the shaft. However, that in itself doesn't mean to say that it's completely wrong, because the wear on the cutlass bearing is one issue, vibration is another. But then you've got your clearances to take into account. You've got clearances between the propeller and the rudder. You've got clearances between the tip of the blade and the hull. And all these clearances should be within tolerance. And sometimes to achieve that, you just have to shift the prop out. This one here, well, that's really been shifted out. And this is a Nimbus, which is where they have actually changed the propulsion system. And as you can see, that projection is, I would say, excessive. This one here, a lovely lady, quite an elderly lady, but she sails her boat, and it was a Victoria 26, this particular sailing boat, and she'd done many thousands of miles in this, and was continuing to do so. Unfortunately, in the process, all their lockers were full of kit. So I couldn't get in through the LAS. When I did get in through the LAS, having emptied it, which took the best part of half an hour to empty the LAS, I got in there and I found that I couldn't get in behind the engine. So I then went into the quarter berth on the other side and I had a look, and sure enough, I couldn't get into behind the engine from the other side either. So I said to her, I said, well, you know, who maintains your boat? Oh, well, I've got a very a very friendly engineer chap who does all my engineering for me, and he looks after the boat. So he does all of that. So eventually I managed to get over the top of the engine, or at least I managed to get my hand over the top of the engine and take a photograph of the back of the engine, and that's what I saw. And in the photograph, obviously you can see that things are not quite as they should be. And also you might notice that the gearbox casing is also cracked. So his well-meaning engineer wasn't really doing her much of a service, really, because obviously he hadn't been in there for a very long time. Now here's a clue. This particular boat had had a problem in the past, and that problem had led to the shaft being changed. I mean, the clue here obviously is you can see that one half of the coupling has been painted and one half isn't painted, and there are marks on it where somebody's been doing some alignments. So the issue with this is, well, what's happened to the boat? When we started to look further, we found out that the boat had actually had a grounding, and they had replaced the propellers and the shaft, and unfortunately not the engine mounts, which also needed to be done. But that was a bit of a clue as to that there was something wrong. I mean, other clues are a bit more obvious, which we'll come to in a minute. This particular vessel, I'm ashamed to say, was a commercial vessel, or it was in commercial service anyway, and it was being used for training courses for RYA yacht masters on power. And this showed a bit of a lack of maintenance. Looking a bit further up the shaft, the coupling also wasn't quite in the full flush of youth, and actually neither was the gearbox. And that was a gearbox on a vessel that was actually in use for training purposes, would you believe? And the mountings they'd been suffering from a bit of lack of maintenance as well. The whole boat was a disaster, really, and I think it led to certainly the coating surveyor was struck off. Unfortunately, another surveyor came in from the same institute, not our institute, thank God, and he recoded it. Unfortunately, it was a member of this institute, our institute, the IIMS, who eventually went to inspect the boat, as it had come up for sale as a coded vessel. And when he saw this, he sent me the photograph, said, "Geoff, surely not, surely not." Yeah, so this caused a little bit of an investigation into standards of coding practice. Another shaft projection. This has allowed the guy to actually fit some additional bits of kit on the exposed bit of shaft. And this one here, well, we'll put a nylon collar in there, that'll help. So, and a rope cutter. So, but how his cutlass bearing is going to get any cooling water, God only knows. But you can see even there that the tip clearances are still pretty tight. It's all down to changing the specifications of a boat without actually changing the layout of the hull and the shaft alignments. This one, a bit of a shaft alignment issue on this one. I think we can safely say that that's obviously had a little bit of a grounding incident. This one a bit more so. This was an interest. This was a 75-foot fairline, which I was actually looking at another boat, which was an 85-foot Princess that unfortunately had found part of Sardinia in the middle of the night at 20 knots on autopilot, and ended up clear of the water on the rocks, which meant that it had to have some very serious surgery to get it put back to rights. And after I'd been inside inspecting the repairs that were being carried out to the Princess 85, I walked outside and there was this Fairline 75 that had also suffered a little bit of a grounding incident. This particular vessel was a very large, very well-known and unnamed mega yacht on its maiden voyage that found itself getting a little bit too close to a gravel bank. This one, yeah, well, yeah, that was a bit something a bit harder than a gravel bank. It looks rather like somebody's gone at it and actually chewed the blades off it. But yeah, another little bit of a grounding incident with that one. Do love some of these shots. All right, well, I'm getting a bit tight on time, but interesting that here is, whether you can see clearly or not, these are two stern drives on the same boat on the same day. The one on the left, you can see that there is a gap between the duo props. The one on the right, there is no gap between the duo props. So this was the port side, the one on the right. And this actually had caused the engine to slow because the propellers were actually wearing on each other, and it was affecting the performance. And it also caused some noise, which they noticed on the way to the hoist. And I said, well, I'm not surprised you noticed some noise on the way to the hoist. So their propellers were actually grinding together on the way to the hoist due to the fact that the bushes had failed inside. Same stern drive, same boat. And I also advised that when they're getting their stern drive sorted out, perhaps they ought to leave a little bit of a clearance around the stern drive between the anti-foul and the stern drive itself. A 1-inch clearance is something we like to see to stop any electrolytic actions going. Oh, my favourite, shaft anodes. All right, most of the brokers around my area are aware of my pet hate with shaft anodes on motorboats. I don't mind a shaft anode on a sailing boat because at the end of the day, it's only going to do 6 knots and the shaft doesn't revolve that quickly anyway. But on a high-speed motorboat, I don't like to see shaft anodes, especially the wrong sort of shaft anode, which it clearly is. Where this one is, the bolt is actually through the anode itself, not through a metal strap which is connected to the shaft. So now this has eaten itself away. It's now moving on the shaft. And here's another couple. This one here, you can see the slide marks where the anode's been traveling up and down the shaft as the boat's been going ahead in the stern, and the same with the one on the right, where they eventually end up blocking the water path through to the cutlass bearing, and they write the cutlass bearings off. So shaft anodes, bit of a pet hate for me. This one here, well, you can quite clearly see that that one's already gone. So here's an interesting little scenario here. This was another insurance claim where a newly fitted sail drive in a sailing boat had failed, and it failed within a couple of months. It did last a couple of months, so to be fair, it did last that long. And the bolts had sheared. I spoke to the repairer about this, and he was, oh, well, it's nothing to do with me. It was all done correctly, all assembled correctly. So I checked, and yes, the sail drive kit comes with 2 sets of bolts. 1 set of bolts is for mounting, and 1 set of bolts is for coupling. Unfortunately, when they put the sail drive and connected it to the engine, they used the mounting bolts on the coupling, and they used the coupling bolts on the mounting, which meant that the bolts that they'd fitted literally had only about 3 threads showing where they were connecting the drive to the engine, which led to the shearing of the bolts and the failure of the drive. Decks. Well, this is the one I mentioned earlier where we had the water running down the electricals. So this deck repair I thought was a little bit below par, to be honest. And there was evidence of leaks inside. And you can see that they actually had lifted the deck at some stage, put something down, looks like plywood or whatever, and they glued it to the deck, and then they put the teak back over the top, but it hadn't lasted very well. Teak decks are a bit of a problem. They do wear. Some are mechanically fixed, as these are, and you can see here where the dowels have gone, and then we're starting to get deck leaks. And this one isn't too badly worn. This one, now you're starting to see all the fixing showing through, and this one's starting to wear away. Unfortunately, this particular teak decking is quite thin, and so there was no hope of actually recovering this and maintaining it as it was. This was going to be a renewal job. And again, we've got the same issues with there. This was a super yacht that I did only a few weeks ago, and this particular boat, 120 feet, got an awful lot of teak, got 3 decks of teak in fact, and the whole lot was very badly worn, and the cost to replace all of that lot was going to be a small fortune and maybe a deciding factor in the purchase of the boat. Another clue to worn teak decks, so you've got a nice dowel standing up there, and of course the caulking is standing proud as well. This one here, bit of a decking giveaway, this one. This was the commercially operated vessel with the rusty gearbox and the rusty shafts. And the maintenance on this boat was pretty poor. And this was the solution to removing a deck filler, which left a hole in the deck. So the solution to that was stick a bit of Treadmaster over it, it'll be fine. Needless to say, it wasn't. Seacocks. Now we're going to have to get our skates on now, because otherwise Mike's going to be shouting at me. Here's some Seacocks for you. We've all been there before. Seacocks come in various standards. Most of them that are being fitted these days, because they are the way they are supplied by some manufacturers. I can't for the life of me say the name of the persons that might be marketing these things, but when they put them in their blister pack, you'll find that the standard of the Seacock is on the side that you can't see through the clear plastic. And it isn't until you paid for this Seacock and taking it out of the packet, you find out it's made in Italy, and it's actually a hydraulic quality valve, and it's not suitable for use on underwater. And this is what happens to them. And we've all seen these before, haven't we? The handles normally go first because they're made of steel. But here you've got so many different metals going on, and so many different reactions going on. And they're all a bit of a nightmare, really. This one very recently I did, and again, it's the wrong grade of Seacock. I didn't really want to put too much pressure on this because I didn't think that it was going to last much longer. They do get through, and manufacturers do fit them as standard, because they satisfy the requirements of the RCD and consumer advice, in as much as they will probably last 5 to 6 years. And if they last 5 years, then they satisfy the requirements. What they don't say is that if you buy one of their boats, once it's 5 years old, you need to change all your Seacocks. And when you change them, put something decent in there. There's another fizzing away Seacock, although at least it is bonded. That's something. Here's a clue to where you've had issues with Seacocks in the past. Is, oh no, there's nothing wrong here. Well, how come you've got a tide line in your bilge? So obviously there's been water in there before, where you've had issues with leaky Seacocks. Access, another one of my pet hates. This particular boat, lovely engine. Look at that, isn't that? That's a joy to behold, isn't it? Look, you've got lovely, air extraction and supply systems in there and everything else. Unfortunately, that is the only access to the engine. I thought that perhaps this panel on the right here was removable, but I was wrong. That is it. So that's the engine installed in the boat. God help anyone who's ever got to do any maintenance on that. Couldn't even get to the oil filter. Same boat. because it's a lovely boat. It's, you know, we're talking millions of pounds worth of boat here, and they also fitted a generator in the the aft cabin, and there's the generator as it is installed. And I'd removed some panels to try and get to it, and then failed miserably because that's as far as I could go with the stripping out. And there is the generator. It's in there. It's lovely. All very nicely installed. You're not going to get that acoustic cover off, I can assure you of that. And that's the distance between the acoustic cover and the welded aluminium frames that are containing it. You just can't believe that people are still building things like this and paying that sort of money for it. Observations. Oh dear, we're back to that boat again, aren't we? Yeah. Anyway, let's leave that for a minute. Observation, insulation, engine compartment insulation. That's not going to pass muster. What's missing? Oh, yeah, shouldn't there be a bathing ladder in there? Yeah, that was a bit of a surprise for the guy when I said, "Oh, well, where's your ladder gone?" "What ladder?" I said, "The one that's supposed to be in here." How to retain your anchor so you can let it go in an emergency. Yeah, great. Okay, yeah. Oh well, okay. Well, that repair's not going to pass muster, mate. You know, no, that's where the deck's cracked on the cable locker surround, and he did he made an attempt to repair it, but it failed. Just general observations here. I think the seals on this fridge freezer have failed as well. This one here they're fuel oil pipes. They weren't 7840 grade, needless to say, and this is the diesel starting to leak out of them. This was immediately before sea trial, and I abandoned the trial. And they said, "Why?" I said, "I'm not going to see in that." Here's another pet hate, one that's coming up, and I believe we've had a lecture on this one, heater installations. Another one of my pet hates at the moment, especially due to some recent fatalities. And this is the air supply going into the heater, which is within the compartment that the heater is installed in. There's no trunking, there's no fresh air from outside, no nothing. And this is a bit of a problem. And it's a problem which we are going to be talking more about in the future, I think, due to these fatalities. I've checked on the rules and regulations for this, and they are supposed to have an air supply from atmosphere. And the question to you guys out there is, how many times do you see one with an air supply trunked from atmosphere? You know, because the danger is that they could be sucking in anything. And the one in question was sucking in its own exhaust leak. So the actual heater was breathing its own exhaust and pumping it into the accommodation in ever increasing amounts until eventually it killed the occupants. This heater was in that's our commercially operated vessel again. And there's a heater installation, and I'm not sure that one's going to pass muster, to be honest. And just to finish off, here was a vessel which I hope I never get asked to survey. And I was very distressed to find out from the guy that owns the marina that somebody was living on that boat up until a couple of weeks previously. And worse than that the guy was living on the boat, and that boat was being paid for as accommodation by the local council.
Oh my God.
Seriously. They've now moved him into sheltered accommodation. But yeah, that was his council accommodation. Which just goes to show the job we've got to do.
Is there any mould on that boat there, Geoff? A bit of mould.
I think there's more things living on that boat than the old guy that was living on it, to be honest.
Dear, oh dear. Geoff, brilliant. Great way to end the day. I don't know if anyone's got any points or questions they want to raise, but No, thank you for sharing your photo album. And,
No, and thank you. And I must say, actually, I think we all, especially those who have been sat watching all these events during the day today, and some of whom will maybe watch some of the events tomorrow, we owe a huge debt of thanks to you and your team for putting all this together. I mean, this is the third year now. And I mean, obviously this year you had your own problems because you've all been suffering from COVID, and some of you haven't fully recovered even now. And I just would like to thank you all for all your hard work.
That's kind of you, Geoff. Thank you very much. And thank you. Thank you to our other 11 presenters today. Big thank you to everybody for being with us, and to those of you who watch this online. You know, we'll send the videos around. Then, you know, I hope you'll enjoy what we put out for you. A lot of the content today is completely fresh. This has not been seen anywhere before, so you know it's great to be able to bring original content, and I think that's what the Institute's very good at doing. Lots of fan mail coming in, Geoff, so you've done a great job.
Well, it was a little bit of light-hearted humour to end the day, really, just to show some nightmares, you know, of things that come along. But
well, I have to say to you that when we did this, or I didn't do it, but Lloyd Griffin III, wonderful name, out in the States, delivered this presentation with the same type of theme. The images in the States are just as bad, in fact, if not worse. So it is not unique to a UK surveyor, but everybody who's online, you know, will know that. So thank you very much indeed.